So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome aboard. My name is Matthew McKenna. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer here at SSH Communications Securities. You can also follow me on Twitter at Protocol Pirate. Today we got a great session for you. We're going to be talking about the failure of access control from network devices to IoTs. It's a really exciting topic because it's something that's been out there for a while that we just tend to not think about enough. And it's actually where a great majority of, let's say, breaches and insider problems are starting from, is around unsecure access into network devices. So let's talk about this from the reality of what's facing us today. A couple of examples. Many of us have followed just in the news last week, basically a DDoS attack on Deutsche Telekom, where essentially there was access to ADSL routers attained through basically running brute force attacks using password lists of commonly known ADSL routers. And essentially through utilizing the SSH protocol and brute forcing with these administrative password lists, they were able to gain access to these routers and essentially engage in a DDoS attack from there. We see the insider challenge of this recently, a couple months ago, that basically a Citibank IT employee deliberately wiped out routers, which shut down 90% of the firm's networks across the US. We see that Akamai recently put a notice that an IoT device essentially had an old SSH vulnerability sitting inside there, which permitted and access to these devices, leveraging this old vulnerability. At DEF CON, at the Black Hat conference, essentially each year they try to have a hackathon around these devices, and essentially they found 47 new vulnerabilities in 23 IoT devices. And what's interesting is on the other side of the coin is that we have the United States Computer Emergency Readiness Team, US CERT, they're telling us, they're indicating to us that there is an increasing threat to our network infrastructure and devices, and that there are recommended mitigations. And so we're going to cover this today. We're going to talk about this failure in access control, and in particular, of course, as us being SSH Communications Security, we're going to take this from the perspective of SSH and what that means from there. So to get started, would you care more today if you had unmanaged access to your most critical infrastructure and applications that essentially users could provision by themselves without oversight? The credentials that they provisioned never expired, and there was no way to trace access to these credentials because there was no identity associated to them. And it's been going on for the last 2 decades, as long as the SSH protocol has been around and SSH command line access has existed to network devices. Many of you may recognize that face there as Mr. Michael Burry of The Big Short, played by Christian Bale. And there's a lot of parallels to this, that story of The Big Short, to what we consider the access governance challenge out in the market space when it comes to how access is governed around the SSH protocol. It is a big short of its own. And so would you care more if these type of credentials and access existed in your environment? Well, the fact is that it does. And they're called SSH User Keys. And if there's only one thing that you remember from today's webcast, please remember these 3 points here. SSH User Keys are equivalent to credentials and equate to access. And they are the only form of privileged access a user can provision themselves without oversight and control. So anybody who's used SSH before, has had access to an SSH client or used PuTTY, they know that with the RSA keygen, they can generate their own key pair and deploy that public key on the server and have that access to that private key themselves. It's the only form of access that a user can provision themselves without oversight. Secondly, what is unique about SSH User Keys, unlike certificates, is that SSH User Keys have no expiration date on them. And SSH User Keys, when we generate them, do not associate themselves to an identity. You can't see from that cryptographic material who this belongs to. Whereas for the password, you're going to see who that password belongs to. So this is what makes these very unique. And if you're putting the pieces together here along with me, you're seeing that, my goodness, we have a real issue here when it comes to these credentials sitting on our infrastructure and our network devices. So let's go into a little bit more detail around the protocol itself and why we should really, really care about this. So if you think about the SSH protocol, there's two primary use cases to it. Remote administrative access. It is the tool of choice of administrators to gain access into our network infrastructure, whether that's to provide remote administrative maintenance on a server, or whether that is to gain access into a database at the operating system level, whether it is access into our network devices, routers, firewalls, switches. We use the SSH protocol. Second use case is the transfer of data between two applications, so SFTP, as we know it. Now, let's think about all the things that the protocol touches in our environment. It's touching storage devices. We use SSH to gain access into our storage devices. We use SSH to gain access into our switches, into our routers, into our firewalls, essentially even into email virtual appliances. Anywhere where there's basically a Linux distribution under it and command line access, SSH is that technique which we gain access to these systems, ADSL routers. And then on that other angle, we think about it, access to databases, access from our on-premise environments into our clouds. If you think about it, this is the tool of choice of developers. So it is playing a very important role in the world of DevOps. The SSH user keys are essentially that threading, connecting the various process of developers through the entire DevOps process. And this access in its basis has a couple of challenges with it, is that it is in most cases, not governed within our organizations from a perspective of how it's provisioned, deprovisioned, and recertified. And as a result, we don't have very good control of how we can remediate non-compliant access and associate this to their respective identities in the organization. Now, if you start to put this around names that you recognize, you see all these tools that we're using in our device, in our networks. These are very familiar names. All of these provide SSH user key-based access. And I'll share a little bit with you as we go forward about how easy this is actually to generate this type of access into these network devices. And so for the most part, SSH is used by administrators, developers, and privileged users in honorable ways. However, on the flip side, SSH is the tool of malicious users, malicious insiders, and hackers, because they know that this protocol is extremely powerful. They know that they're able to gain control of private keys out in the environment because they know that those keys are not being monitored. They know that once they gain that elevated access to a system, that they can generate their own key pairs. They know that with SSH, they can essentially effectively move unnoticed in an encrypted fashion laterally across the network. And so we often hear that, well, I've never heard the smoking gun around SSH. And the response to that is, well, how would we know the smoking gun around SSH if we don't have any governance around it as it is today? And we'll talk a little bit about in a second why that is. Now, SSH is the plumbing that bridges our environments together. If you think about this, it's being used on premise for interactive administrative access. It's being used to move that data between applications. It's being used for access into our cloud environments, into the operating system levels of things. It's being used to move data into our cloud environments through SFTP. However, one of the statistics we've heard a lot about is that about 60% of breaches are brought in to our environment through third parties or introduced by third parties. And our supply chain is becoming ever more integrated with the emergence of IoT and cloud adoption and whatnot. But if you think about in the simple perspective about a managed service, that maybe we outsource the service of our firewalls in our organization. Well, those engineers from our third-party vendor are coming in to provide that administrative access very frequently with SSH. And very frequently, they may be setting up key-based authentication to these devices to eliminate the need to continuously have to type in passwords. And so we have a situation here where this access is essentially out of control. But SSH is touching everything. It is completely pervasive across these environments. But why don't I hear about this problem more often or more frequently? Well, I could put this question back to you and ask, who owns SSH within your organization, and who owns SSH access, and who owns SSH user key-based access when it comes to provisioning, deprovisioning, recertification of this access? And you'll see that this challenge here is it intersects across so many different areas. However, at its core, SSH user key-based access is an identity governance administration issue. We don't have processes in most of our environments today about how this access is being provisioned. We often see customers maybe approaching this from an enterprise key management side. PKI teams may be managing SSH keys, but they're coming at it from a different angle. They're thinking of it very frequently from the perspective of certificates, that I have some cryptographic material, I manage encryption keys for storage devices, whatnot. And so we need to rotate these keys, but we're not thinking as tightly as we should to the access related aspects of this key-based access. And then from the other angle, you have privileged access management vendors also approaching the problem or challenge around SSH user key-based access, but they're very focused on root keys and DBA keys, and they're very focused on the interactive aspect of it and gathering private keys and placing these private keys into vaults and whatnot. However, what we see out in the market space is 80% of access actually in our networks is automated in nature using SSH key-based authentication. So it's not covering all angles of the puzzle here. And it's actually the intersection of these three areas that unite basically governance, data security, key management, and privileged access to gain control of this. And it's actually encompassing multiple facets of our organization. But the core it should be starting at as identity and access management should own this issue. Cryptographic services play a complementary role in this. Security is going to be a part of this. Unix and Linux distributions, this goes across all of our platforms here. Application owners, this affects them as well because they don't know what trust is coming in their applications, what's going out. And again, if you think about network devices and network device security, security operations usually, network security usually is responsible for that. And how is key-based access governed there to these devices? And then you have the whole entire emerging world of DevOps. So we don't hear about this problem necessarily because the ownership within our organizations is unclear. And identity and access management haven't really grabbed onto this because it's maybe been looked upon as a cousin of the PKI space. So there's an ambiguity in this and a lack of understanding around SSH in its entirety, which makes it a little bit sometimes the unwanted stepchild inside the organizations. So let's talk about the access governance gap to our critical network devices now. So it's extremely easy to set up access to a network device. And I just took a couple examples here, but you can see here that every single network device out there has some form of SSH related command line access to it. And in all cases, gives you the possibility, almost all cases, gives you the possibility to set up SSH key-based administrator authentication. So this is relevant for Palo Alto firewalls. This is relevant for Cisco ESA, email security appliance. Again, gaining access through SSH public key authentication. Our Juniper devices here, the same thing on the X series switches using SSH user key-based access. So every single one of these devices, you can go out there, you can Google this along devices that you own, and you'll find a guide and setup in every single one of these devices is how do I set up SSH key-based access? So think about that and play the connection back and say, okay, administrators are providing these keys, but how are we controlling the administrators that are providing these keys? And what is our process around how this access to these devices is being provisioned? So once I gain that elevated access to that device, I can drop in a key. This is also relevant for IoT devices. If you think about a lot of IoT devices, they're based off of Linux distributions. So if you think, let's take a very simple example here on the Windows side, a Raspberry Pi 2 device here. Essentially, you can connect to that device using SSH. So it gives us a possibility to go to that Windows IoT core device, have an SSH client, and connect to that device using SSH. And again, you can drop in a key pair. Same thing goes with other devices, an Intel XDK app. Again, you see here on the side in the picture is that authenticate through username and password. However, you can tick box, use SSH keys. So again here, you have that possibility to set up access to these devices using SSH key-based authentication. So this is spinning across not only our traditional network devices, but also it's relevant for our IoT devices that have Linux-based distributions in many cases. So how do we regain control of the critical access to our network devices in our environment? There's a couple of best practices that we should be taking into consideration when it comes to network device security. One is, of course, segregating networks and functions. This is a very logical one and goes hand in hand with number two in terms of how we limit unnecessary lateral access in the environment. Now, if you think about this, with an SSH user key, you can dictate what commands can be run when that authentication is utilized. So if an administrator drops in that key and there's no force command and there's no IP source restriction, that means that administrator can run every single command which is permitted across the SSH protocol. So they can tunnel, they can use agent forwarding, they can run their shell commands, everything that gives the power within the power of the protocol, they can do. So limitation of unnecessary lateral access is important. Hardening our network devices, turning off those things that don't need to be on in our network devices. So you can access network devices through unsecured protocols, things like Telnet. We don't need that. We should be turning those things off. But the most important piece here is number 4. It's about secure access and things that we should be doing when it comes to accessing these type of network devices. Multi-factor authentication is a big component here. Management of credentials, especially SSH keys. If you think about it, how many of us actually go out and scan our network devices, have accountability of SSH user keys that have been dropped into those network devices? So that means if a malicious user gains access to that network device, they can regain and control and provide themselves that backdoor using key-based access. Another thing is session monitoring. A lot of solutions out in the market today are challenged when it comes to session monitoring on network devices because they're agent-based. And a lot of these network devices are not friendly to have some type of agent sit on them. So it essentially gets forgotten very frequently when it comes to the session monitoring aspect. So access is really the key piece here, which we should be considering when it comes to access of our network devices. And then there's finally out-of-band management. So when we do go in and do maintenance and administrative access to our network devices, this should essentially become an out-of-band practice. And then finally, a very obvious one is integrity checks of our devices, not buying and using devices from gray markets, using them from reputable vendors, checking the configurations on those, validating that there's not preset keys sitting in those, that the firmware has been issued with the same keys. These happen out in the environments frequently. So we have these 6 points here that we should go check, because this is really an area when it comes to network devices where we're not really thinking about the potential access and backdoors that it's providing into our network infrastructure. And if we go from the assumption that the bad guys are already on the inside, then they are trying to camp out, leveraging this type of infrastructure. So if we think about SSH key-based access today and where the market space is going, if you think about it, the challenge is that in most organizations for the past 20 years, administrators have, without any governance, been able to provision their SSH user keys. And as we haven't kept inventories, we're not monitoring the authentication practices when these keys are being utilized. So we don't have any process. We don't know where they're sitting. We have all this access being provided and we're not having any visibility around it. And as a result, we don't have the capability to remove this access or rotate this access because we don't understand the interconnectivity behind this. So we don't really understand if we're compliant or not. And then the worst part about this is that this is all manual work right now. So when people are setting up key-based access for valid reasons, besides that there's no governance to it, it's a very labor-intensive process with a lot of human mistakes in there. And you see my visual on the side, and this is more of a visual from application to application and connectivity. But just to give you an idea here, on the right side, we're looking at 650 AIX servers inside a banking environment. And this is all the valid combinations of private and public keys across those 650 AIX servers. So you see that we have just an unmanageable mesh of trust relationships. How can we find the needle in a haystack there? And how do we reduce this complexity in our environment? So there's a couple steps here. We're going to talk about the first step is regaining control of our environment. And then we're going to talk a little about what the future holds for us and where the market space is actually heading to when it comes to SSH user key-based access for our on-premise, our clouds, and our network devices. So when we talk about regaining control, first and foremost is we first have to get discovery going, understanding what key-based trusts are actually sitting across all these network devices, and start to monitor these to even see if they're being used. In our deployments and our customers, we see that up to 90% of SSH user key-based access is obsolete, legacy access sitting in the environment, still providing access, but not being used anymore, not authenticating anymore. So that's leaving a lot of free ground to grab onto there. After we have visibility, I have to understand what our policies are from an access perspective. This is where the governance comes in. And essentially lock down that ability to generate that access by removing these keys off of these devices into essentially root-owned location. And then from there, getting into the automated lifecycle management of how we provision, deprovision, and rotate this key-based access, and integrating this over into our overall identity access management framework. Now, at SSH, we've been over the last 2 to 3 years really spending our time sitting there and saying, do customers actually want to be managing SSH user keys over the long term? And the answer is no. No one wants to sit around and manage a whole bunch of cryptographic material. And our customers say to us, I want to manage access. I don't want to manage keys. So where's the market space heading? If you think about our cloud transformations going on and how everything is moving rapidly and dynamic, we see all these things being spun up and spun down real time. The future of access is going in this direction as well. And if you think about it, on the cloud side, if a server gets sick, we kill the server and we spin it back up. In our traditional worlds, if a server gets sick, we need 3 administrators to go play with it, fix it, and get it back to shape. So in the cloud world, our servers are static, configuration changes are minimal, and we have the needs of scalability. When it comes to access in the future, though, what we want to be doing is leveraging all those tools around us. We want to be leveraging role-based controls of our Active Directory and LDAP. We want to leverage things like the Open SSH certificate authority and figure out ways that we can create on-demand, just-in-time access. And now if we start to move into this world of, let's say, associating a certificate that the Open SSH CA provides to that access we're providing and linking this in together with our LDAP and AD and provisioning this just for the time that's needed, we actually solve the SSH user key challenge. We create a scenario where no longer can users provision their own keys. We create the scenario that this key, because it is attached into a certificate, has an expiration on it because the certificate will expire. And because we're associating that certificate to a role-based access in our Active Directory, we have accountability in terms of who's accessing. And then we no longer have the situation where keys are actually sitting on endpoints. And we have the possibility to actually move off of SSH user keys and get to a point where all the access being provided is on demand with a short lifetime credential that's no longer sitting on the endpoint, leveraging things that exist already. So we become extremely in line with the automation principles that we're moving into today when it comes to the worlds of IoT, cloud, DevOps, and whatnot. So at the end of the day, we want to manage access. We don't want to end up managing keys. And the same holds true for network devices. So the questions you should be asking your organization today when it comes to, do we have sufficient governance for our most critical access? SSH is by far probably the most critical access you have in your environment because this is where the damage can be done. This is the operating system level access that administrators have, potentially malicious users. And if they get that access, a lot of damage can be done in terms of data theft, downtime of systems, and brand damage, of course. And the issue is, do we have visibility? Are we able to inspect SSH encrypted command line access from administrators, developers, third parties into our environment and into our network devices? If third parties are accessing our network devices, do we have visibility into that? And do we have unknown credentials, key-based credentials, sitting on those devices? So once we get an understanding through visibility of that risk, we can ask the control questions. Do we have control? And think about that from a compliance perspective. Is our access being governed? Do we have a process in place in terms of how this type of access can be provisioned? And if we have non-compliant access, what can we do to remediate it? So ask yourselves the questions: how is SSH key-based access being provisioned in our environment? How is it being deprovisioned? How is it recertified? And what can we do if it's out of compliance? And then finally, how do we provision this more effectively? As we talked about in that last slide, that we want to manage access, not keys, and move forward. So how do we gain efficiency and control over those topics of provisioning, deprovisioning, and recertification? And how do we reduce the complexity? Because if we think about it, we're seeing in our customer environments millions of SSH user key-based trusts, which are very challenging to associate back to identities. That's a hell of a mapping exercise to go through. And so we want to figure out ways, how do we gain that visibility, regain control, and then enable our customers to manage this critical access in a much more convenient way. As a going away thought, good governance isn't always obvious. SSH is one of those things that people don't think about every single day because it's just been working there as the plumbing of our environment for the last 20 years without a care in the world, and it's just worked and done its job. But that encrypted access there, that road there that connecting these two sides, people are going around. And we sit there and we think we have a good solution by putting the gate there in the middle, but very easily we can drive around. So with that in mind, I'm going to leave it open to a couple of questions here. Just going to go back to get my controller side here. So the first question is, what are the challenges of the solutions on the market when it comes to the management of access to network devices? That's a very good question. So I think the thing that we see is that this has kind of come in as an afterthought a little bit in the privileged access management space. We consider network devices, but we're not well equipped to manage access to them because they're not friendly to deploy agents and things like that on. Many of the traditional systems out there are not very well equipped to, let's say, have access controlled on them or session monitoring enabled on them in a convenient way. So I think one of the challenges is that there's very few solutions that do session monitoring well in terms of video recording and playback and those type of things at a protocol level to these network devices. But on the other side, there's not any solutions on the market space, with the exception of SSH Communication Security, that, let's say, goes out and actually discovers SSH user key-based trust and manages SSH user keys on network devices. There are tools out there that are managing certificates to network devices, but combining all these three things of, let's say, certificate management, SSH user key management, and session monitoring to network devices would be an extremely powerful solution there to be able to provide that visibility and control into this network-based access. So the next question I'm seeing here is, where should the ownership of this sit? Is this really an identity access management issue, or why can't PKI's teams manage this? There's no, let's say, true right or wrong answer to this. First and foremost, it's good if organizations are managing this key-based access in the environments. However, what we need to consider when it comes to SSH user keys, unlike certificates, is SSH user keys provide access. And because if we remember those three things that I wanted everyone to remember at the beginning of this, is that SSH user keys can be provisioned by anybody, they don't expire, and they're not associated to an identity. So we have an identity issue here where we don't have visibility and control and governance around who's behind that authentication when someone is using SSH key-based access to authenticate to a device.